Welcome everyone, my name is Eugene.
And I'm Gabriella.
And we're Master of Public Health students at Mailman School of Public Health. We spend a significant amount of our time at work, and whether we work full-time or part-time, so having a healthy work environment can improve the quality of life and promote well-being. Especially as all of us are navigating through this challenging time of uncertainties, isolation, and added life stressors from the pandemic, it is ever more important to foster a supportive environment and empower everyone to build resilience. That is why Gabby and I are thrilled to partner with Trauma-Free NYC to deliver this presentation on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs in short, in the workplace. This webinar is designed for the research staff of Columbia University Irving Medical Center, but the information is useful for all workplaces and job functions. Today, we will cover 4 topics. First, what adverse childhood experiences are and how they're relevant in the workplaces. Second, how ACEs can show up in your workplace and how to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma response. Third, reasons why we should address ACEs in the workplace. And lastly, ways to foster a supportive, effective, and trauma-informed work environment. This webinar contains information that you could find disturbing or upsetting. Please take care of yourself and utilize any of the resources that will be shared at the end of the session if you would like. If you're using this webinar for a group discussion, we have some recommended community guidelines. Participate fully and respectfully at your own comfort level. Speak from your own experiences by using I statements. Be open to new and different perspectives by listening and taking the time to think about what is being said and trying to understand where others are coming from. Respect and maintain confidentiality, and what is shared in this room should stay in this room. And lastly, and most importantly, please take care of yourself. This could mean using the restroom, stepping outside and taking a break, or intentionally choosing what to share and not to share. Please pause the video and see if anyone would like to add on to this list, and if everyone agrees to this guidelines. Lastly, whether you're watching this webinar as a group or alone, please take the time to pause and reflect on some of the questions we'll be asking throughout the session. Before we begin discussing what adverse childhood experiences are, let's do a case study on Jordan. Jordan is a qualitative researcher who is examining the health impact of long-term home quarantine on pregnant women. You are working with Jordan on transcribing the most recent batch of interviews for future publishing. You have noticed that while transcripts for semi-structured interviews and high-level findings have been due 2 weeks ago, Jordan does not seem to have even finished the interviews with participants. Jordan has been ignoring texts and only responding to emails after a few days, claiming that the interviews are almost done. You are concerned for Jordan, but also frustrated by the lack of communication and the delay in deliverables. As Jordan's colleague, how would you describe Jordan's behavior? How would you respond to Jordan's lack of communication and failure to meet the due dates? Please pause the video and individually reflect on these questions and write down your answers on a piece of paper. We will revisit the case throughout the session. So, what are adverse childhood experiences? You may have heard many other terms related to this topic, such as life stressors and adversities, child maltreatment, child abuse, and child neglect. Childhood adversity specifically refers to adversities experienced during childhood, during the ages below 18. These events include those that negatively influence children's physical, psychological, and social well-being. Some examples are shown on the right. Among different types of childhood adversities, adverse childhood experiences specifically refer to 10 types of adversities in the domains of child abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. The term child maltreatment refers to child abuse and neglect, where child abuse means intentional act of inflicting harm on a child, and child neglect means the failure to provide necessary care, which leads to illness and/or injury. And these are the 10 specific types of ACEs. They include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, having a family member with a mental illness and substance use disorder, witnessing domestic violence, parental discord, and incarceration of a family member. These adverse childhood experiences can result in stress, toxic stress, and trauma. Stress is an emotional and physical tension you feel due to an event, thoughts, or experiences that can make you feel upset and/or nervous. It's a response to a challenge or demand, and in a short term, it can actually help you adapt to changing environment, avoid danger, and/or meet deadlines. But if the stress continues for a longer period of time, or if you experience a severe life adversity, you could experience something called toxic stress. And without adequate support or resolution, toxic stress can overactivate your stress response system, causing structural, biological, and genetic changes in the brain and the body. And they can cause serious physical and mental health problems. Trauma is a type of outcome that could also result from experiencing an adversity. People can develop trauma from one single event or a series of events that they find emotionally and/or physically harmful or threatening. We will discuss more on signs and symptoms of trauma later this session. Both toxic stress and trauma can change the brain function and structure, impacting attention, decision-making, learning abilities, social functions, as well as stress response. As mentioned before, they can also contribute to physical symptoms and increase the risks of diseases. But not only physical, emotional, mental, and social wellness, ACEs can also impair job performances. The impacts of toxic stress and trauma we mentioned can last for years, even during adulthood, and can ultimately lead to relationship problems, emotional distress, and involvement with more risky health behaviors, such as substance use. So the disrupted cognitive, physical, emotional, and social functions can directly and/or indirectly lead to poor work performances. And these can have grave consequences, both in individuals and in organizations as well. Studies confirm that with higher ACE scores, which indicate more types of ACEs someone has experienced, the person is more likely to experience work absenteeism, serious financial problems, and serious problems performing at job. And a study conducted in California found that ACEs can cause a lifetime cost of $183,000 in each person who experienced child maltreatment from loss of productivity alone. So how common are ACEs? It cannot be happening around us, or could it? Surprisingly, ACEs are pretty prevalent. CDC reports that 61% of adults in the United States have at least one ACE, and 1 in 6 adults have experienced 4 or more ACEs. So while this prevalence level may differ by various social factors, including those related to occupations such as subject matter and job functions, ACEs may be as prevalent in your workplace. And if you're curious what your ACE score is, you can visit acesconnections.com to find out. Now that we have learned about what ACEs are, how prevalent they are, and how it can influence work performances, let's take a deeper dive and learn how it can show up in your workplace. During this section, we will learn how to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma response, and we will also share tips that could help in these situations. ACEs can affect workers in 3 levels. On a personal level, how you process and respond to workplace environment and stimuli. And on an interpersonal level, how you interact with your colleagues and/or clients. Lastly, on an organizational level, how the culture shapes your and your colleagues' work experience and interactions with each other. Then, what are some specific things in workplaces that could induce trauma response? And what are some of the signs and symptoms that we could see? A person, whether it is yourself or others, can have trauma response related to ACEs at workplaces. Some of the triggers could be directly from the work environment, such as conflicts, lack of trust, heavy workload, lack of support, unclear expectations, moral and ethical dilemmas arising from the work, and having a lack of resources to handle the work-related issues. Also, some triggers could be from the work itself due to the content of the work. Workers can hear upsetting stories from clients or be directly exposed to trauma that can remind them of ACEs they have experienced before. So knowing signs and symptoms of trauma can help yourself and/or your colleagues respond to stressors and triggers in an effective way so that you can create a supportive and resilient professional environment. So how do trauma responses look like? Responses to trauma can be either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. Signs and symptoms you may see in individuals in the hyperarousal, fight or flight mode are anger, sweat, dilated pupils, raised voice, accelerated pace of speech, hypervigilance, tense muscles, and increased rate of breathing. Someone in the fight mode can seem aggressive, angry, controlling, and perfectionistic, whereas those in the flight mode is always on the go and can seem to overachieve, micromanage, and overworry. If you notice this in yourself or a colleague, activities that could help are taking a break, doing breathing and grounding exercises, doing meditation, and taking a short walk. We will share some of the online and mobile apps that could help you with these exercises at the end of the session. On the other hand, the hypoarousal mode, freeze and fawn, happens when the overwhelmed system shuts down the body and tries to conserve energy. Some signs of freezing you may see are disengagement, glazed eyes, social withdrawal, avoidance, and loss of motivation and humor. Fawning is when a person becomes people-pleasing to diffuse conflicts and create a sense of safety. You can see them constantly apologizing, not being able to express their thoughts or feelings, flattering others and putting others' needs above their own. To help someone experiencing the freeze and fawn mode, you could suggest taking a break, doing meditation using one or more of the 5 senses, such as smelling lemon or coffee, or naming 3 objects in the room, and by giving them assurances with a calm and slow voice. What could happen if the work-related stress and trauma responses are not adequately addressed? They can lead to burnouts, which is the state of mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion. And workers can also develop vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. And especially for those who are in the helping professions, such as those in medicine or social work, and those who work with clients who have experienced trauma, they can be re-traumatized by the repeated exposures to others' traumatic experiences. And this is called vicarious trauma. Compassion fatigue occurs when there is a prolonged and profound emotional and physical burnout that these professionals cannot recharge and become indifferent and have a hard time being empathetic towards others. And the person can experience all three, and the signs and symptoms include a lack of motivation and interests, reduced productivity, and sense of helplessness, hopelessness, cynicism, and resentment. And without proper solutions or care, these can lead to grave psychological consequences, such as depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Now that we have learned more about ACEs and their impacts and outcomes in the workplaces, let's revisit the case study on Jordan. As you recall, your colleague Jordan has not been meeting deliverable due dates and have been not responding to your texts and emails in a timely manner. Before, we reflected on how we would describe Jordan's behavior and how we would respond to Jordan's lack of communication and failure to meet the due dates. Now that we have learned about ACEs and trauma responses, would you answer any of the questions differently? What could be potential triggers or signs and symptoms of trauma that you could potentially glean from this scenario? Also consider, what assumptions do you think you were making about Jordan before? What assumptions do you think you are making now? Please pause the video and again, individually, reflect on these questions and write down your answers on a piece of paper. We will revisit the case study again later this session. Next, Gabby will share more about how ACEs are relevant in the workplaces.
Thank you for sharing that background information, Eugen. Now that we've reviewed what ACEs are, you may be asking yourself, why is this important to me as a research professional? To start, it's important to consider the array of indirect outcomes related to personal trauma and mental health status. As Eugen previously mentioned, people who have experienced one or more ACEs are vulnerable to experiencing a range of emotional and behavioral health concerns. In turn, they're more likely to experience impairments in their ability to work related to poor mental health. High rates of job turnover, chronic absenteeism, and poor quality or productivity in the work setting are just a few outcomes that have been associated with ACEs in the workplace. Beyond the individual level, ACEs have been associated with impaired decision-making, increased interpersonal hostility, and inability to comply with workplace policies. It's also worth noting that previous experiences with trauma can confound with present workplace stressors, contributing to overall increases in daily stress levels. Now, let's take another moment to consider the social norms that exist in the Columbia University Irving Medical Center work environment. Are there any? If so, what are they? Feel free to pause the video to think this question through. The social norms you've identified in the CUIMC workplace may not be conducive to your emotional health and wellness. For this reason, we're going to share some tips and tricks for addressing ACEs and trauma in your work setting. In doing so, we hope to support your development of professional and healthy workplace interactions. In the context of your workplace, there are a variety of actions that you can take to create a trauma-informed space. First, we'll discuss the basics of trauma-informed care. Next, we'll introduce some tips for trauma-informed interactions with your coworkers. And finally, we'll leave you with a few additional resources for addressing ACEs and trauma in the workplace setting. Before diving into the steps you can take toward trauma-informed interactions, we want to remind you that you are not responsible for controlling the actions of your coworkers. Our recommendations are not intended to make you feel obligated to change or correct someone's actions. Remember that your personal health is valuable, and there should be no pressure to undertake the following recommendations until you have provided yourself with adequate self-care and whatever method that best suits you in order to address your own needs first. It's been said that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and we believe this philosophy rings true to mental health care, especially as it pertains to trauma. The tactics we are teaching today are guided by trauma-informed care methodology. Trauma-informed care is defined as the implementation of practices that promote a culture of healing and empowerment under the assumption that each person has experienced trauma in their lifetime. Trauma-informed care, or rather trauma-informed interaction that we will be working with it, is characterized by 6 pillars shown here: physical safety in the immediate environment, emotional safety for the reception of care, trustworthiness of care providers, collaboration between different providers, choice regarding the actions taken by both providers and receivers of care, and finally, empowerment of those receiving the care. As opposed to the provision of care, individuals in the research setting should seek to enact trauma-informed interactions from what they've learned today. Ultimately, the goal for today's session will be to take what you learn about trauma-informed interactions and apply that to your future office or workplace dynamics. In addition, social and cultural norms are a part of every facet of life. It's important to acknowledge the role that norms play in simple interactions with our coworkers. By understanding diverse backgrounds, you can anticipate how interactions may go with your coworkers and make an effort to navigate cultural differences during your time together. Above all, we should honor and celebrate these differences instead of looking past them. Remember that your coworkers may not feel seen or represented in the work setting, which can add to their daily experiences with toxic stress. We encourage you and your team to access appropriate and diverse mental health resources that account for potential experiences with community or collective trauma. To help, resources of this nature will be included at the end of this session. Before engaging in trauma-informed interactions in your workplace, try asking yourself these questions. What are my emotional boundaries? Has my coworker mentioned past experiences that make them feel uncomfortable or explicitly stated their triggers? What assumptions have I made about my coworkers and their actions? How could I make the work environment feel more safe for myself and my coworkers? If someone decides to disclose their experiences, how could I better listen and affirm their experiences and empower them? Please pause the video and reflect on these questions. Now, we'll outline some tips for trauma-informed interactions in your workplace. Here, we have 3 interaction scenarios that simulate the trauma-informed conversations in your workplace. Suppose you identify someone in your workplace that has been difficult to work with, like Jordan from our case study. In this scenario, you've been asked to take on an extra task by the coworker, though you already feel overwhelmed by your current workload. In this sort of situation, it's vital that you establish your personal boundaries. Before you rush to say, yes, consider if you have the emotional and physical capacity to take on this extra work. It's okay to give yourself a break, or even suggest an alternative that's easier on you. You could try saying something like, I'm sorry, but I need to take a second for myself right now. I'll be back in 10 minutes, and maybe then we can talk more about this. Or, to offer an alternative, you could say, sorry, I don't have the bandwidth to take this on. Is there another way I could help get this project done? From there, you can work with your coworker to divide up their responsibilities in an effective and fair manner. There are plenty of tech resources such as Microsoft Teams, Asana, and Google Drive that can assist in the division of work as well. In this next scenario, suppose you've made a simple mistake in the lab. This can happen to anyone. But in this instance, your coworker finds out and proceeds to yell at you for being incompetent in front of your other coworkers. This behavior is clearly disrespectful and uncalled for. However, before you respond back with the same energy, consider how your coworker's recent and even past experiences may be contributing to their short temper. For this reason, it's helpful to respond with respect and compassion, as difficult as this may be. Stay calm and try to see your coworker as a human rather than as their anger. You could mention, "I apologize for my mistake, but I think it's important for us to have mutual respect in the work setting. I was surprised with how you reacted earlier. What do you think are some ways for us to better communicate our needs and feelings?" Indeed, it's worth noting that you are also a human being and deserve to be treated with dignity. If you feel that any member of your workforce is crossing a line of respect with you, you're encouraged to contact CUIMC Human Resources for further support. The contact information for this office will be listed at the end of the session. In this final scenario, another coworker pulls you aside after witnessing the conflict in the lab. They explain that they felt triggered by the yelling and were reminded of a negative childhood memory of a similar scene. At the moment, they don't feel safe in the workplace. This is troubling, and you may feel the urge to comfort them or remove them from the scene. Though these actions would be helpful, the most effective action you can take is to offer collaboration, choice, and empowerment for their professional support. Be empathetic and empowering in your recommendation. Yet, try not to force anyone to make any major decisions at the time of event. You could say something like, "I'm sorry that you're feeling this way. Your feelings and experiences are valid. What would be most helpful for you right now?" If they seem open to extra support, you could add, "If you're interested, let me share some resources I found useful for processing difficult events." From there, you can link them to one of the many resources available to you as CUIMC employees. Again, we will share several of these resources along with their contact information at the conclusion of this session. Now, one last time, let's revisit the scenario we introduced at the beginning of this presentation. When you consider your interactions with Jordan in the workplace now, how would you respond to Jordan's lack of communication and failure to meet the due dates in a trauma-informed manner? What could Jordan's colleagues and supervisor do to proactively support Jordan in the workplace? Please take a moment to consider these questions and discuss as necessary. To conclude, let's recap what we've learned about ACEs. Foremost, ACEs have real-life impacts on one's health that include physical, mental, and emotional issues. These concerns can affect one's health over the entire life course and extend into their professional life. Next, anyone can be impacted by ACEs. That includes you, your family, your friends, and your coworkers, because ultimately, your coworkers are human beings too. So when establishing and considering your current or even future career plans in the research setting, it's crucial that you establish boundaries, listen respectfully, and allow for mistakes with your coworkers. In doing so, you'll be contributing to a healthier, happier, and more successful work environment. As promised, we have an array of health resources that will support your participation in a trauma-informed workplace. Here, we've listed a number of educational resources for further information about ACEs. This includes several websites, videos, and books that may be of interest to you. At the bottom, we've also listed 4 online resources for mental health emergency contacts: the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the New York City Well Hotline, the CUIMC-specific Employee Assistance Hotline for personal confidential counseling and referrals to professional services. And finally, graduate research assistants may also access CUIMC's My Student Support Program for counseling sessions through Student Health Services. Feel free to pause the video to take down or screenshot these resources. We will also provide access to these presentation slides for your future reference. Lastly, here are several mobile resources for assisting your workflow and break time activities. To help with effectively responding to stressors, you may want to download a mobile app for guided meditation, such as Calm, Pacifica, Headspace, Insight Timer, Mindfulness Daily, Happify, Breathe to Relax, and even an adult coloring app. In addition, you may want to utilize project software such as Asana, Microsoft Teams, Slack, or Google Drive if you're not already using them. Again, please feel free to pause the video for reference. For your use, we have even created 2 custom resources that may support a trauma-informed workplace. First, we have a brochure that summarizes the information we've shared in today's presentation. This brochure includes background information on ACEs and the recommendations we've gone through for promoting trauma-informed interactions in the workplace. This can be used as reference for future interactions you may have in the workplace setting. Next, we have a desk sign that can be placed at your workstation when you step away for a break. Simply print out the template and fold the paper into a standing sign. This sign also features several tips for making the most out of your break time, as well as contact information for local support and crisis hotlines. Here are our references. On behalf of Eugen and I, we'd like to thank you for participating today. This concludes our presentation.